Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods. He is shattered to the ground. Hello, everybody. This is Gilgamesh, and this is part of our continuing series on the book of Isaiah. And today we are talking about chapter 21. Chapter 21 has three separate oracles in it. Each one is labeled as a masah, or a burden that is carried by the prophet. And we're only going to look at the first one in today's episode. So this is going to take us through the first, I think, about 10 verses of the chapter. And as we look at this, it's interesting because we, in our last section, switched out of the normal format for this area of Isaiah and went to something that was very specific and historical, referencing certain political leaders by name. Now we have switched back into something that we have a very hard time fitting into history. And there are a lot of interesting ideas around this, but we're not really sure what this section is about. And all three of these oracles in this section here are a bit ambiguous. So as we start off in chapter 21, verse 1, we start off with the oracle concerning the desert of the sea. Now, desert of the sea, this sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, and attempts to explain it have not been great. The best scholarly guess, according to Robert Alter, is that it refers to a Mesopotamian marsh region that would have been in Assyrian territory at the time of Isaiah and under Babylon later. I don't agree with Alter here, and that's unusual because I generally like his interpretations, but what seems to follow is very dry imagery, not marsh imagery. So that's problematic for this. Now, the Septuagint does not have the word sea here. And some have suggested that the best solution is just to delete that second word entirely. Biblia Hebraicus Cadentia suggests that by adding two letters to the word sea, it can read the turbulent desert. That's a possibility. Now, another possibility that I think is the most attractive one is if you remove the space between the words desert and sea, midbar and yam, then it can be read as a simple plural, deserts, midbarim. This seems to be the most convincing argument that we have out here. So perhaps this opening line should be the oracle concerning the deserts. There doesn't seem to be anything else in this oracle that references the sea in any way. So that's what I would tend to go with. As the verse continues, as whirlwinds in the Negev sweep on, from the desert he comes, from a terrible land. Now, these whirlwinds in the Negev is a triangular southern portion of modern Israel, and it has long been a very harsh desert. The word Negev can also be a more general word for south. From the desert he comes. Who is it that's coming? Well, one thought based on what follows here is that this is some sort of an invader that is coming. Moving forward here, a stern vision is told to me. The betrayer betrays, and the destroyer destroys. Go up, O Elam. Lay siege, O Media. A hard vision's being told to the prophet here about betrayal and destruction. They have two sets of words here that are very similar in form and do this thing that they love doing in Hebrew, where they have a verb and a noun that come from the same root coupled together. And so this betrayer betrays, haboged boged, and the destroyer destroys, hashoded shoded. And you can hear the rhythm there, haboged boged, hashoded shoded. This is typical Hebrew wordplay. The idea here that you are to go up Elam and lay siege Media, these are historical references to peoples that were two Mesopotamian peoples. But we're not sure what Isaiah would have known about these people or why they would be mentioned here or what they have to do with anything in this prophecy. Now, the one obvious thing here is Media is the one with Persia that overthrows Babylon eventually. That will be some 200 years in the future for Isaiah. Maybe he's talking about that. Why is Elam in there? We're not sure. But we're going to have Babylon mentioned later on in this oracle. And so that's one of the thoughts there, is why it's listed here, is because it will eventually overthrow Babylon. But we're really having a hard time figuring out what historical reference Isaiah might be trying to make with this, or what imagery these two nations would have conjured up to his original audience. He goes on here, all her groaning I bring to an end. The her here would logically refer to Elam and Media, though there should be a plural referent here instead of the singular, and less they're viewing it kind of as a collective plural. Some scholars aren't sure that the word groaning is the right word here, and they try and amend the text to say joy. All her joy I bring to an end, which would then be that the idea that the invasion is going to end the joy, rather than all for groaning I bring to an end. But I think groaning kind of works here based on what follows, because we're about to go into some real childbirth imagery here. And this may be saying that the pains of childbirth have come to an end, that we have delivered the child. Let's take a look at this here, starting in verse 3. Therefore my loins are filled with trembling. Contractions have seized me, like the contractions of childbirth. I am bowed down from hearing. I am dismayed from seeing. My heart staggers. Horrors terrify me. The twilight I longed for has set me to trembling. So we have some very potent imagery here of childbirth, and it is done in the first person. My loins are filled with trembling. Contractions have seized me. So who is it that is speaking here? It would seem that it is either Isaiah speaking himself and putting himself in the position of childbirth, or he is speaking on behalf of God, and that he is placing God into this motherhood role of childbirth. It's not really clear which it is. If we look back to the previous verses here, it does seem that the referent would be God himself. But these sudden changes in perspective and person are very common in prophecy. And so it's not totally clear who the me in this is. But whoever it is going through this process of childbirth. This imagery shows that it is a painful and exhausting process. This word for shuddering that Isaiah uses here is a fairly rare word, al-khala. It has that repeated syllable that Isaiah loves so much. And this imagery of childbirth is something that Isaiah frequently comes back to. This has a lot of the same vocabulary that Isaiah used back in chapter 13 when he talked about childbirth there. And he uses this interesting thing about the twilight that I had longed for, the twilight I had hoped for. This is a unique phrase, and it's not entirely clear how it should be understood. It seems, though, that perhaps what he is saying is using this childbirth metaphor. This is an expression of how an expectant mother would look forward to the day of her child's birth. But when it arrives, it's quite the harrowing ordeal. Still, this passage is a bit of a mystery in its intent. Why was this evening hoped for? And why is it an evening of pain and suffering? And what does any of this have to do with a storm in the desert or Elam or Media? It is very difficult to put this together as to what we're actually saying here. But we go forward in verse 5. Prepare the table. Watch, O watchman. Eat, drink. Arise, O princes, oil the shield. Well, the first line here, prepare the table. Orok hashulchan. It's a familiar phrase to many who follow Jewish religious law. The Shulchan Aruch, the prepared table, is an important concept in Jewish ritual law. But the idea here is that we are setting up for a fancy meal. And then we have this very unusual phrase that follows it here, tsafo hatzafit. We don't know what that means. Spread the rugs? That's one possible translation of it there. Prepare the tables, spread the rugs. It is a cognate accusative where the verb and the direct object come from the same root, but we have no idea what that root means. Some have tried to say that it means something about tables, that maybe it is intended to be parallel with the first line. Prepare the tables and table the tables. But I think that Robert Alter, in this case, I do agree with him. He makes an argument that it should be watch, O watchman, because this word is very similar to the word for watchman that follows immediately afterwards. And that his idea is that this is a contrast to preparing the table. We switch from the idea of prepare the table to set out a watchman for invading armies. And then he flips back to eat and drink. And then he flips to oil the shield, meaning that you are preparing for battle. And so it is this contrast from the fine meal to suddenly war being upon them. The shields back then were generally made of leather. Sometimes they were studded with metal, and rubbing the front surface of the shield with oil would make them slippery and more of an obstacle to the enemy. In any case, both these lines here seem to be talking about the switch between peaceful enjoyment and war. We come to verse 6. For thus my master said to me, go set the watchman. The word here, my master, we're not sure if this is supposed to be a divine reference. The word is Adonai, and that is frequently a title for God, but it is also a term used for an earthly lord, Adoni. We're not sure which is intended here. It might be that this is the earthly master giving the directive to go set out a watchman to look for invading armies. It is also possible that Isaiah, who was previously voicing from the perspective of God, has now switched back to his own voice, and that this is a declaration of a further message that my Lord, the God of Israel, has said to me, and then he begins this quote, go set the watchman. Or he could be talking again from telling the story of a earthly lord saying to set a watchman. Now, some interpreters would like the watchman to be the figure of the prophet, but it could be an actual literal watchman. There seems to be a lot about this that is about looking at people coming in an invading army. The word for watchman is very similar to the words back in verse 5, and that supports the idea that that should be let the watchman watch, or watch, O watchman. So continuing with the translation here, it says, what he sees, let him tell. And he sees a chariot, paired horsemen, chariot of donkeys, chariot of camels. Let him listen diligently, very diligently. This is an unusual turn of phrase here. Chariot of donkeys, the word for chariot and the word for rider are very similar, and some translations will go with a rider of donkeys and a rider of camels here. And because of that, actually, it makes this verse very important to Muslims. In a time when Muslims and Christians were debating a lot about what the meaning of the Hebrew Bible was, there was one particular Islamic scholar, Ibn Qutayba, who said, and in Isaiah it is said, I was told, stand guard as a watchman and watch and report what you see. I said, I see two riders approaching, translating as riders rather than chariots, one of them on an ass and one of them on a camel. One of the two said to the other, fallen is Babylon and her graven idols. This refers to this section of Isaiah. And says he, the one riding the ass is taken by us and by the Christians to be the Messiah. Now, if the one on the ass is the Messiah, then why should not the man riding on the camel be Mohammed? For did not the destruction of Babylon and its graven idols occur at his hand, not the Messiah? For there continued to be in the region of Babylon kings who worshipped idols from the days of Abraham onwards until our prophet Muhammad appeared. And is not the prophet better known for his riding a camel than the Messiah is for riding an ass. This comes from a book, Camelia Adang's Muslim Writers on Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. I'll put a note to it in the comments. And so the idea here among Islamic scholars, at least at this time, was that Isaiah foretold both the Christian Messiah and also the coming of Muhammad. Now, Christians do point to the Hebrew Bible as having a verse about the Messiah riding on a donkey or an ass. That is generally Zechariah 9:9 and not this verse. This verse seems to imply invading armies, and there doesn't seem to be anything that I can see in this that really relates to the Messiah, and I think that relating it to Muhammad is probably not very supportable, but that is the interpretation that was given to it. But in fairness to Ibn Qutayba, it is true that idol worship did continue in the Mesopotamian Babylonian region until the time of Muhammad. He is the one who did end idol worship in that area. And so there is that point that he makes with this that seems to be accurate. But the key word here seems to be this idea of translating the word riders here. It seems that it's talking not about people riding on these different animals, but actual carts that are being pulled by them. And it doesn't seem to be talking about two individuals, but two groups. Moving forward here to verse 8. And he who saw cried out. The traditional text has had the letters scrambled in this verse a bit. And so it actually reads, he called out a lion, which doesn't make any sense. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Great Isaiah Scroll, it restores the correct word here. And the word for lion is very similar to the word to see. And so it is not that he cried out a lion. It is the one who cried out is the one who saw. So, and he who saw cried out, meaning the one who was out there looking at things. So the idea of a lion being referenced in this verse is just a scribal mistake. But no, it makes much more sense here. And he who saw cried out, upon a watchtower, my master, I stand continually by day, and upon my lookout, I am stationed all the nights. Beautiful A-B pattern here in parallelism with the Hebrew. And so who is the watchman? Is it just an ordinary watchman? Is it someone giving a prophetic message? It's still not clear, but here he is saying that his job is to look out from his post by both day and by night. And in verse 9 it reads, and behold, this comes, a chariot of a man, paired horsemen. And he answered, and he said, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he shatters to the ground. Now, first remember that Babylon is not yet a world power. It would eventually fall to the Medes and the Persians, as we mentioned, but that is almost 2 centuries away. Now, of course, Isaiah may not be limiting himself to speaking of the historical Babylon. Earlier, he spoke of Babylon being dragged down to Sheol for its arrogance. So what do the coming writers have to do with Babylon? And why would seeing them indicate that Babylon had fallen? It also seems that this declaration about Babylon does not come from the watchman himself, but is the answer of Adonai after hearing the watchman's report. If you look here, it says that the watchman is speaking, behold, this comes, a chariot of man and paired horsemen, and then it switches, and he answered. The verb here indicates this is an answer to what the watchman was saying. So this is a back and forth dialogue. The watchman is the one saying that he sees the chariot and the paired horsemen, and then the one he's speaking to, which would be the one identified as my master, answers back. And it's the master that seems to be saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all of her carved images are smashed to the ground. How does the master know that? What about horsemen coming tells him that Babylon is fallen and that the idols are smashed? It remains a mystery and really isn't explained at all. There's a lot of this that is very dramatic. The imagery of the whirlwinds in the desert and the one coming from the desert and riders on horses and the watchman looking out, all very poetic and dramatic. But the question of what does it mean is actually quite daunting. Well, verse 10 here, we follow it up with a bit of a coda. "O my threshed one, and son of the threshing floor, what I have heard from the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I announce to you." So we now seem to have returned to the perspective of the prophet, declaring that this message comes from God. But the choice of addressing his audience in terms of a threshing floor is kind of unique. Threshing floors were very important to the children of Israel, and they are often used as places of great sacredness and of communal gatherings. There's nothing in this or the two oracles that follow that actually indicate there's anything in this about the kingdom of Judah. They seem to not mention Judah at all in this. We're not sure where this watchman is watching, and we're not sure where Elam and Media are coming from or where they're going to, and how does Babylon get involved in this. This seems that this could just as likely be talking about some other nation and its involvement in this process. There's nothing here to clearly connect this back to the kingdom of Judah, nor is there in the next two oracles. And the way that he closes this here, indicating that what he just said came from the God of Israel, does seem to almost indicate that he might be addressing a people that are less familiar with a prophecy like this. Now, "Oh, my threshed ones," this threshed ones here, this word only occurs here, but it comes from a root that means to be trampled. And so some have left the agricultural metaphor and have translated it something more like "my downcast one, my trampled upon one," because that is what you do with the grain as you put it into the threshing floor, as you trample it. This might be some sort of a metaphor there for being downcast. But then this second part of it here, "the son of the threshing floor," that's an unusual Hebrew phrase that's kind of cool. Some translations go with a little looser translation like "my winnowed one," but the literal Hebrew says "the son of the threshing floor." And it just seems like a very abrupt end to the prophecy here. And it may be placed here along with the next prophecy because they both mention the theme of Watchman, even though they use actually different words for Watchman in each of them. So we're left with a bit of a mystery. What does all this mean? What was the prophecy about? Who is the prophecy actually addressed to? All of that remains somewhat questionable. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, give me a like and a subscribe if you could. That really helps out the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.